So now we've got where these organisms live, whether they're terrestrial or they're aquatic. Now we got to figure out how they got to where they are, and that's called dispersal. Today we're going to really get into how organisms are distributed across the planet. The way species are distributed, that is where they live, is based primarily on ecological factors. Can that area support them? And their evolutionary history. Do they have the adaptations they need to get from one point to another? Take the Burmese Python, for instance. Lives in Burma. Yeah, Burmese, there we go. Totally different part of the earth. Can they get to Florida? Can they disperse themselves to Florida on their own? No, because there's a freaking ocean there. It's not going to work. So how organisms are distributed is based on their evolution, their ability to move, and on whether the ecology support them. Dispersal is the movements of individuals away from their point of origin. You guys know what this is? It's a dandelion, right? A lot of people, they've got this idea that you can pick them and you blow them, and if you can blow them all the seeds off, you make a wish. You've heard of this before? Each and every one of those seeds has the potential to create an entirely new dandelion plant. Dandelion plants, though not invasive, are a pain in the butt to pull out of the ground. That being said, fun story, the entirety of the dandelion is edible. So if you were ever to, this shouldn't happen to you, but do you guys know what scurvy is? Scurvy is a disease among sailors from basically the ancient past, because the way you combat it is by having vitamin C. And if you don't, basically your spine curves. It's painful. Turns out, it's not just oranges you can have, but dandelions. If you eat dandelions, you're not going to get scurvy. There you go. Big survival tip for you in the future. Make a nice dandelion salad. Sorry, that's totally off track from what these things are. Seeds that blow in the wind, getting to where they're going to go. I used to have a whole bunch of dandelions in my yard. I worked on clearing them out because I didn't want to have, I have clover now. My kids, in their ever so usefulness, would pick the dandelions as they grew and blow them all throughout my whole yard, because that was fun for kids. And that was a bad idea, because what that was doing was redistributing them, dispersing them out further into the yard. So then what I had them do was I said, but it makes the wish come true more if you go right to the edge of the property and blow into the neighbor's yard. So now what happened? I don't have nearly as many dandelions. I was the point of origin. But now they're spreading that way, away from my yard. So that's dispersal, moving the individual or the gamete farther from where it started. How about this? How many of you guys are not from this area? Cool. Like, where'd you come from? Oregon. That's a huge dispersal, right? You took your gametes, because you bring them with you wherever you go, and you got them in a car or a plane, and you brought them all the way across the country. Hundreds of miles you've dispersed from the point of origin. Make sense? Many organisms are geographically isolated. That is, they only exist in a certain location. And a lot of that can be explained by a lack of dispersal. For example, here's the ocean, here's a lake. Why is it that these lake creatures don't live out in the ocean? It's a saltwater lake. Why aren't they in the ocean? Why are they independently evolving in that lake? Right, they can't get across the land bridge there. That Burmese python couldn't live or couldn't get from Asia to America because there's a big freaking ocean there that will stop them. There's a geographic barrier. Does that make sense? That explains most reasons why an organism lives in one part of the world and not another. But if somebody brings a new organism in, and that organism begins to reproduce successfully. The reason for its lack of distribution was a lack of dispersal, not because it couldn't live in that area. For instance, the Burmese python, because that's apparently what my go-to today, can live just fine in the Florida Everglades. The reason it didn't live there beforehand was due to a lack of dispersal. Nobody imported it in, but the environment could support it. So far, so good? Now, an invasive species is going to be one that can successfully breed in a new environment and compete with existing species. So it's been brought in, it's been dispersed by humans usually, to an area where they've never been before, and they take off. Here are a few good examples. I've been talking a lot about the Burmese python. This is the brown tree snake. Now, just the idea of tree snake is bothersome to me because it means there's a snake in a tree. But the brown tree snake ended up eating most of the birds in Guam. So Guam was an island, tropical bird paradise. As humans moved onto the island, they brought with them, by accident, brown tree snakes. I think they brought them in actually in trees they imported. That brown tree snake ended up eating their way through most of the tropical bird population. These stink bugs are terrible. You guys, it's getting to be colder outside, so they're starting to come back into your house. They don't normally live here, but they've really established themselves. And because of that, they're a nuisance. They're eating their way through our local populations of insects. Florida pythons are probably the biggest example right now that people talk about. They're eating their way through, like I said earlier, 90% of the mammal population in the Everglades. Sometimes they there was a news video from last winter that showed a python strangling and killing an alligator. Sometimes the alligators win. Especially for the smaller pythons, an alligator will eat a python. They do compete with each other as top predators in the ecosystem right now. In this case, neither wins. Here you can see a python, the head's up at the top, tried to swallow an alligator. But what happened was the alligator's claw was out when it was being swallowed. And so as the python is swallowing, the claw is just raking along the inside of the python until finally it's just ripped open. Yeah, both lost. I think a great example of this, and I have a whole book on this in my office if anybody wants to read more about it, is the northern snakehead. I want to tell you the story of the northern snakehead. The northern snakehead is endemic to Asian rivers, and it is a top-tier predator. It eats all the other fish. Basically, the snakehead is the top of the food chain. It's also a delicacy. Regionally, it was thought that if you were to create a soup out of snakehead, it will heal people. It's like chicken soup, basically. Does that make sense? So, in the States, the northern snakehead was brought in. It was kept on ice. In, was it Reston, Vienna, Virginia? It's up near Tyson's Corner. Basically, it was brought in. There was a gentleman who wanted to, his wife was very sick, so he bought 2 snakeheads in order to make her this soup. She got better, so he put them in a tank to keep them. They were fresh, still alive. Put them in a tank. And then they started to outgrow the tank. So instead of killing them, because that would be mean, he dumped them into a retention pond behind like a CVS pharmacy. Retention pond, sort of like what you got coming in here. That's like it's just a pond that you pump wastewater into, basically. You know what I'm talking about? You see them all over the place. He thought to himself, it'll be fine. It can live out its snakeheady life right there. A few A little bit later, probably a year later, a father and his son were at that retention pond fishing together, and they caught one. They took a picture. They sent it to Department of Wildlife Resources up in actually this is in Maryland now. Sorry, it wasn't in Reston. It was in Maryland. Took a picture of it, sent it to Department of Wildlife Resources. They said, "Where'd you find this? This is bad." They indicated where they found it. Scientists from the department went out. They went fishing because apparently it is somebody's job just to go fishing all day. And they caught 8 of them. They said, okay, this is a problem because the guy threw 2 in. They hadn't figured out who the guy was, but there are 8 in there. So then they had to do another test. The next stage up of the test was basically to run an electric current through the water because that will stun the fish. They ran electric current through the water and they found locally like 15, 20 snakehead fish came to the surface at different levels of development, juveniles and adults. Okay, this is a problem, not something they could control. So what they decided to do was to, basically take cyanide and pour it into the retention pond to kill everything in there. The way cyanide works is it prevents these fish from getting oxygen. So they dumped cyanide into the pond, and they said the pond began to bubble. Not because of a chemical reaction, but from all of the fish trying to get air. Now, northern snakeheads, like betta fish, are able to gulp air from the surface. So they drained the whole pond, and they found hundreds of northern snakehead fish in there. And they hoped that they'd caught the whole problem, that they'd fixed the whole thing before it got out of hand. The issue was this particular pond was set up about 100 feet away from the Potomac River. And when it rains, there may have been a spillway between that pond and the river. Not too much, just enough to make it muddy. But, oh wait, I didn't tell you, the snakehead can walk on land. It's a lobe-finned fish, so it's able to drag itself through mud. And it can gulp air. So the thought is, several of them, before they caught this problem, went from the retention pond, crawled through the mud, over into the Potomac River, where they've been eating their way up and down the Potomac ever since. Yay, invasive species. So that's a local invasive species. We'll talk about some others. The zebra mussel is basically the James River used to have a mussel, and now it's got these zebra mussels that have completely outcompeted it, and they are dangerous to local wildlife. They produce more toxins. So there's a lot going on. What can limit dispersal then? You got a lot of things that can limit dispersal, even among invasive species. One is going to be biotic factors. If you have one species preying on another species in a given area, it can prevent that prey species from dispersing to a larger area. If you find, for these invasive species, something that hunts it, you can get it into check. The problem comes when there's nothing that eats the invasive species. In fact, one major way of combating invasive species is to find a way to either us eat it or encourage another organism to eat it. The lionfish is an invasive species in Florida, and the way it's completely out of control. One way that we're trying to control it is quite literally to convince people, this is a delicacy and you want to eat more of it. Probably. Abiotic factors are those non-living factors that can hinder a species' ability to survive in an environment. Temperature, water, oxygen, salinity, sunlight, all of these play a role in stopping organisms from expanding. The alligator, as we just talked about, is endemic to Florida. It lives in Florida. What's the northern range of the alligator? The highest north it comes right now. Norfolk. That's right, up to the Virginia coast. What stops it from going higher is temperature. Gets too cold, it doesn't live. What happens if the Earth continues to heat up? What's going to happen to the range of that organism? It's going to keep going north. Does that make sense? So, water. A lot of organisms need water to survive. If there's no water present, say in a desert, you can't extend into the desert. Deserts typically act as walls to stop organisms from expanding. Oxygen, obviously. Without oxygen present, you can't live. If you have a low oxygen environment, say in a noxic or low oxygen water, you're not going to have many fish. Sunlight salinity. So how much sunlight's present? If there's no sunlight, you're not going to get many plants growing in a deep, dark cave. So these abiotic and biotic factors can then determine the density of a population. So how many organisms can live in a certain volume of space. And I say volume, not area, because we're talking 3 dimensions here. I put a picture of a tree here for a good reason, and I forget what that reason was, but it was a great reason. I think it was because I'm looking at a single tree here. What's happening in that with this is showing that there's a low density of trees in that area. There's nothing else for this tree to compete against. So that tree will get big and take up a lot of space. What would happen if there were lots and lots of trees around? Would the tree be as full? No. Probably be smaller. So we've got dispersal of species, and that dispersal is usually going to be caused by the evolutionary adaptations of the organism, how it's able to move, as well as the environmental conditions. Can the organism survive in that region? If an organism can survive in a new region and outcompete existing species, it will be considered invasive. And the way you can control an invasive species is through either biotic factors like predators or abiotic factors, changes to the system itself. Questions or concerns?